Audience, welcome to Viewpoint From Overseas. I am your host, Misbah Azam. With me, my usual friends, Mr. Riaz and our own Sabahat Ashraf. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to talk about the kind of revolution in the media in Pakistan, how it went up, it hit to a very large industry, 85, 88 billion industry, and then it started declining over time. And now the thing is that there is regulations started coming from the government, and we will look into that. We will have a deep dive. Recently, our friend Riaz had did some research on it, and he had a very nice blog. You can go and read it in his webpage, riazhaq.com. So let me start from Riaz with permission of Sabahat. Riaz, just please tell us what you see, what did you find out when you were writing this blog about this media?
So recently there has been some turmoil in Pakistani electronic media in particular, but in media in general. And hundreds of journalists have lost their jobs, journalists and other staff working for the media companies. At least one TV channel, Waqt News, has stopped.
Went off the air.
Has completely shut down. And there's a lot of concern among the media people. You know, they're very unhappy, obviously, many of them who lost their jobs in particular. There's one that I was listening to the other day, Matilda John, who used to work for Waqt.
Wow.
He's obviously very upset because he lost his job. So I wanted to look into it. There were accusations that the government is doing it deliberately to try and punish the media,
voices of dissent.
Yeah. And it's trying to basically impose a kind of a censorship by controlling the purse strings. So I looked into it, and it turns out that the media in Pakistan has been growing at a very rapid pace. Double-digit growth, even 18 years after the deregulation. The deregulation happened back in 2002. And now in 2018, last year there was a 14% growth. So it's a very, very long expansion, very unusual in terms of the growth rates. Usually what happens is that in the beginning...
May I interject here? So when you say 14% growth, you're talking about overall media, which include radio, everything. Okay.
But the biggest growth still comes from electronic, from TV, because that's been... Now, in terms of advertising dollars, the growth is shifting, even though the numbers are still very small for digital media. But as the access to internet is increasing very rapidly in Pakistan, almost 1 to 2 million new subscribers are coming online for mobile broadband every month. Because that is expanding, there are more and more people who have who see the social media. So a lot of the growth has actually shifted in terms of the real growth from TV to the digital media.
Digital media is the one on the social media, people...
Online advertising, basically. It could be anything. It could be on Google, Google Ads, could be, Facebook, could be anything else, Twitter. So all of that combined. So there's a shift going on. Now, the other thing that I found is that, and this is data from Aurora. Aurora is a advertising industry magazine in Pakistan. It's owned by Dawn Media Group, which tracks the advertising industry and media industry in Pakistan. according to their data, last year, the total spending on media in 2017 was 88 billion rupees, which was a 14%, which was a significant increase over 76 billion the prior year in 2016, and 67 billion rupees in 2015. So that growth. Now the other thing it says is that at least 20% of the growth of the 20% of the total $88 billion last year was in the form of government advertising, which is substantial. And in some media, and in particular TV channels, almost 50% of their money came from the government. Now, when the PTI government took over, they decided to cut back on advertising.
Okay.
And when that happened, a lot of these people started to lose money. And that is the basic cause for the layoffs, for the slowdown in the media business.
Okay, so Sabahat, how you see that? Because look at, I mean, most of, as Riaz mentioned also, that a lot of these journalists, they are looking into some sort of sinister actions going on by the government, that only those people are being targeted who are very critical to the government. I mean, we can name them. I mean, Murtaza Solanki, Nusrat Javed, and Matiullah Jan, and Talat Hussain, and, you know, name them, they are like that. You never hear that Arif Bhatti has any problem with a money crunch or anything. How you see overall situation of the media?
I would like to take a step back and take the history of Pakistani media.
One moment, I have to interject you here, and I would like to tell my audience that our Sabahat was involved with media for a very young age. Although he's an engineer, he's a very good engineer. But go ahead, Sabahat.
Well, technically, I'm a technical writer, not an engineer in my day job. But anyway, so the history of media goes back further, right? I mean, when Pakistan started out, we had some of these revolutionary papers, Dawn, News. It's not News, Jung. These were publication houses that had actually come out of the independence movement. Dawn famously claims that Quaid Azam founded it, when I think it was more a case of Jinnah Sahab encouraging certain business groups to work on that and then working with them. And that situation, especially through military rule in the 50s and 60s, and to Bhutto Sahab's time, there was a certain way of after all, we had a dictatorship controlling media. Bhutto Sahab, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, introduced the idea of patronage, or at least he used it, like he did with a few other things. He wielded the government advertising budget as carrot and stick to try to influence the media. So there's that factor, and that is what Riaz Sahab is mentioning, that even today, 24% of media spending, ad dollars or rupees, come from the government budget. Now, once you introduce patronage into a market, if you remove it, it's going to affect the market. You can't say it won't affect the market, right? It's going to happen. And Bhutto Sahab, actually famously, Bhutto Sahab used to use the advertising budget. And back then, when media was mainly print media, he also they used to have government subsidized newsprint, the paper.
Yeah, they actually had a quota, newsprint quota.
They had a quota,
yes.
And so they would get subsidized newsprint, and he would control that as a way of controlling newspapers. So he, like a lot of these things, Bhutto Sahab takes some of the, responsibility for introducing these, this kind of government and other interference into media. That is one layer that was already happening. So by the time we came up in the 80s, and this was under General Zia, I was, like you mentioned, I started a bit of a media career right after high school in the late 80s. And at that point, we had a military dictatorship, let's call it what it was. And they had a pretty tight throttle on the media. And this was a time when, especially in the third world, Pakistan was a third world country, we had only, especially on news, state-controlled media had a monopoly on news, right? So on electronic media particularly. Newspapers were independent but not very free. When you're talking about media, one has to separate the concepts of being independent versus being free. These newspapers that I said came out of the independence movement, Dawn, the Herald Group as it is called, Dawn, their newspaper being Dawn, and then the Jung Group, whose newspaper is Jung, and they had English newspapers back then as well. They had an evening paper. Those guys were independent. They weren't owned by the government or anything, but they were not very free. I remember working in a very basic, very glamour-based youth magazine and getting a show cause notice from General Zia's Public Information Department saying, why did you print a Christmas message? Do not print religious messages without our approval. And it was a completely innate...
And you are telling your personal experience.
Yes, this was, I was a very young editor at the Teenager Pakistan, and I decided to put a, we'd like to wish our Christian readers a Merry Christmas message on the table of contents, literally half a paragraph with a couple of jingle bells and a holly leaf on top, and we got a notice. So the military dictatorship had set that in motion. However, since then we've had another 2 rounds of democracy or controlled democracy, and talking to newspaper editors, like at least one major newspaper editor just 2-3 years ago during Nawaz Sharif's rule or before that, you will see newspaper articles sometimes, like there was one newspaper article I remember in one of the major English papers that to me seemed like it hadn't been edited. It was completely lousy English. There were typos. There was none of the professional polish. So I asked this editor and I said, why did you guys publish that? I don't understand. He said, listen, what we do is we get this thing from the powers that be, in this case, the ISPR or whatever, and they'll come and tell you we have to publish this. And we can't not publish it. We live in Pakistan. We have to survive. But what we then do as a means of passive resistance, we just published it without editing it. On the other hand, self-censorship, especially since Zia's time, I experienced it, and most probably from before that, self-censorship had become part of the media process. So they would not do anything to upset them. You even remember, even billboards would have anything
paint on that.
And that was, sexuality or any kind of, they had strict rules, but that has been going on. On the other hand, so we have patronage, we have the carrot and stick thing, we have this interference from the security state, let's be frank about it, indirect media processes. Now that brings us to today, where, by the way, the opening of the media did not start in 2002. Deregulation happened in 2002. But before that, in the first Benazir government, and by the way, if you will remember, what happened was when they first gave the first 2 licenses to electronic or TV media, they still did not allow them to produce news. They could only do entertainment. And entertainment was still censored for morality and all of that. That was the first step. And under Benazir, actually Benazir had a run-in with the media. She tried to censor, she tried to set up a code of conduct or something. The media went on strike. So they had that. And that brings us to this discussion that later by the time, I think it was Musharraf's time, and Musharraf tries to take credit of, I liberated the media. See, we have to look at the evolution of Pakistani media in the wider evolution of media across the globe. Social media and online media has come into existence. Electronic media is much more free. And that has also become part of the scenario. That's when deregulation happened. And General Zia first deregulated, and then towards the end of his rule,
General Musharraf.
He tried to push back. That actually blew up in his face. And these things are happening. So now, to get to your question of what's happening, like I said, patronage, this 24% of total media spending that is coming from the government is patronage. And at one level, one has to give the PTI government some credit for following up on their promises to reduce government interference and taking away the advertising, saving government money and all of that. But then the question becomes, how are they doing it? So it's not an either all, they're all good or they're all bad. They're doing it. It's a good thing.
That's true.
However, within the media houses and because of the other levers and players, we keep saying government versus media.
Yeah.
Let us also talk about the security state. Let's talk about the interference of the security state and the ISPR and all of that in media. I mean, you talk to any practicing journalist and they will tell you, we get direct.
Yeah, and I do talk to a lot of journalists, and they make a lot of complaints. But Riaz, you went into the depth and reading all this media thing and all that. So just enlighten us how you see where the whole media is heading towards.
Yeah, I think one thing we have to recognize is that commercial media is primarily a business, and they're in the business of making money.
Sure.
Public interest and other things
comes later.
Secondary.
You're right.
So
everywhere in the world.
Basically. Yeah. That's how commercial media is.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they will always be sensitive to their sponsors, to their advertisers. I mean, just recently you saw that there's a guy by the name of Lamont Hill who made some comments on CNN.
That's true.
That criticized Israel, and he was immediately removed.
That's correct.
And we've seen so many examples of it where the sponsors withdraw support and that show is canceled, or that channel basically backs off, or gets rid of certain, So the same thing happening in Pakistan is not a surprise to me. I mean, if we are going to have commercial media, we have to expect that. The other thing that's important is, when I used to work for Intel, and when Intel started this Intel Inside campaign
for the microprocessor,
to support the microprocessor, Pentium Inside. A lot of us say, hey, what are we doing? I mean, we're not a consumer company. Intel doesn't sell directly to consumers. We actually supply
Who cares if it is microprocessor, of course.
We supply chips to companies that
make the computers.
Sell to the end customers like IBM, like Compaq, like Dell and those companies. So why are we getting into this business? And I was told that Grove's thinking, at that time Grove was the CEO, is a little different. What he thinks is that when you buy advertising from the media companies, they give you more favorable coverage. And you have some leverage with them. And when the Pentium campaign started, there's one adjective that we all insisted every media report carry with it. And that adjective was powerful.
Powerful.
And all these reports said, this computer has the powerful Intel's powerful Pentium processor.
Yeah, that's true. That is very interesting.
I think it's very simple.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, journalists who lose their jobs because they don't follow certain guideline, certain expectations of them. I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah.
I don't know why we're surprised. Obviously, I know I have sympathy for those journalists who lost their jobs. I think, they obviously put food on the table. But I think fortunately for them, the social media is pretty strong right now. And the other internet type media is pretty strong. They can go and do other things. They can go to podcasts. Podcasts, you can make money. You can start, we have a channel on YouTube.
That's correct.
They should basically find other things to do.
Yes.
Instead of, just be on the dole. I mean, I think some of the people who lost their jobs, probably the channels that they were working for, were more dependent on government dollars. So they had to be more sensitive to what the government wanted. The other thing is possible, those shows that these guys were running were actually receiving sponsorship from government dollars.
Yeah.
So it is not a surprise to me at all.
Yeah, and you raised very interesting point regarding the advertisement. So there is a small story I want to share. The Motorola, we were working in the division, we were making a very low power devices, very low power devices for computer, and those days it goes to camcorders and all that. So the commercial was, the advertisement they were doing, they have pictures of all these big dictators in the world, Nero and Roman Empire, and then Motorola chip. and then it says, not every world leader is a power hungry.
It's a cute one.
It's a very, very interesting.
Good take on words,
that they say world leader at one end and not a power hungry because it is a very low power device, So I really always remember that, that
brings us to the idea of world leaders also not lasting forever, right?
Oh well, that's true.
Is gone.
they also go. Sabahat, if I ask you this question, how we go further, where you do the projection, and tell us and enlighten me and my audience with your opinion, what will happen next? The social media is going to destroy the monopoly of the media?
See, having actually studied this at grad school, you sort of get into the discussion of there is no such thing as one destroying the other. They have to evolve. The invention of the radio did not destroy newspapers. Newspapers had to evolve.
Let me tell you what is the reason I ask you this question. Because like Riaz says that all the media, and correctly said, that all the media is commercialized. Social media is not commercialized.
I don't totally agree with either statement. Okay. That either that all media is commercialized or that social media is not commercialized. I mean, especially in the third world, as we have seen, there is such a thing as the digital divide. The old saying about, there used to be this saying said that freedom of expression is only free for those who own a printing press. Then we got the internet where everyone can own a printing press. But there is such a thing as the digital divide.
Yeah, but it's actually disappearing very quickly.
I don't think it's disappearing. I mean, the other thing is just like
people are coming online.
But if you look at media history, when radio came on, the same thing used to be said that radio will be
but the radio was repurposed,
and then it was
basically a device that you could listen to while
you are driving cars.
And that's exactly my point, that these things get co-opted and repurposed. And then when television came along, everyone thought everything else will go away. But we still have radio stations. We still have TV.
Yeah, but I think they're not as powerful as they used to be.
I agree.
They don't have the same.
Also, no, but here's the thing. Yeah. The role changes, right? The role of a newspaper is different today than it was before. And we all whine about newspapers in the US getting destroyed. They didn't get destroyed just because the internet came along. For my money, two things happened. First of all, the American media was stupid for 2 decades. They kept complaining about the internet rather than trying to figure out how to use it. Frankly, only in the last 10 years or so has the American media started to harness the internet properly. And like I said, we have to look at that evolution in Pakistan as well. And here I would like to step back and disagree with Riaz when he says that what's happening in Pakistan is the same thing as the US. I do not agree.
Okay.
When we talk about freedom of expression, for example, let's take it from that level. Who gets to control or censor the media is important. If it is market forces, as Riaz said, pure market forces, that is one thing. And government control and censorship is a completely different thing. Those of us who believe in unfettered, as the US Constitution says, you will make no law to restrict freedom of expression, believe that it is not the government's role or state institutions' role, different institutions, to censor the media, because that is always a bad thing. Now, market can step in, as happened in the US and happens, where certain lobbies have very strong control over the media, most famously with Lamont Hill and other things. And even that is changing now. There was, to be very frank, before 9/11, you could not even, no one could have even thought of doing what Lamont Hill did, right? Remember that first essay by Mearsheimer and all out of Harvard? It was a big thing.
Yes.
That they even acknowledged the phrase Israeli lobby on NPR. Yeah. Before that. So these things evolved.
You're talking about they had a book also.
They had a book in which they said the Israeli lobby exists. Yeah. It has a strong influence.
You're right.
See, again, not to get anti-Semitic. We're not saying, oh, the Jews control everything. No. But they have a presence. They have heft. They have... whatever. But what is happening in Pakistan is not the same thing. Like I said, there's a couple of layers we're not talking about or don't, which is that the security state tries to interfere. In the US, we have a law against military or government propaganda within the US on national security issues. Pakistan, it is everyday life for a journalist. And by the way it works is they don't approach journalists directly until things get out of hand. It's usually the owners. And that brings us to the other thing. We keep saying media is commercial or media is right-wing. The right-wing says media is left-wing. The left-wing says media is right-wing.
Yes.
What happens is, especially in today's world, ownership of media houses has gone to business houses. That is right-wing. So the owners are more right-leaning, but the people that work in the media, any journalist who honestly and objectively works in the media for a number of years starts to drift either to the left or becomes completely politically agnostic. And they start calling out everyone. So you will often find that ownership is right of center, the workers are left of center, and there's a constant push and pull between the two. And in the end, media in the last few decades has become news media. See, again, we keep saying media. News media versus entertainment media are two different things. Since cable TV has come, cable news has come on, they have merged. CNN to me is not news, it's infotainment. And that is, if you look at Pakistan, that has also happened.
Okay.
In fact, all the major TV stations started out when the deregulation happened being trained by American media experts. And that is why it is not a coincidence that their formats, their left versus right format, their screaming matches are very American in style because they were trained by Americans.
Okay. Yeah. So I will give maybe we have 2 more minutes to go, Riaz. If you say something 1 minute, and if you want to have some rebuttal, and then
I think
finish with
the statement, the blanket statement that we just heard from Sabahat, that the national security state does not interfere in the media in the United States, is not accurate.
No, I did not say that.
There may be a law, but they still do. There is at least several instances where CIA has deliberately done that. There was a journalist who broke the story of how the CIA was involved in the drug business to support the Contras, and that those drugs that were being peddled were actually being sold in the poor neighborhoods in the United States, where a lot of the African Americans were mainly affected. CIA did not like that story one bit, and what they did was, according to the guy who was, CIA guy who worked at the time for the CIA, he said that we had considerable assets in the media that we used in this instance. So what they did was, there was a whole bunch of other journalists who wrote against this guy, and eventually he was driven to suicide. But there's just one instance.
That's a local story,
BBC, we know, BBC acknowledged just, recently in the last few months, that all of their journalists, key journalists that they hired, they made staff, editors and reporters, were vetted by their intelligence services before they were hired. They wanted to make sure that these guys are not anti-national or not anti-British. So the way the national security state deals with the media in each country is different. They don't go and attack them directly, physically assault them, or have them beaten up. But they find other ways to try and control what goes on the media.
Yeah.
So in conclusion, I would first of all like to clarify that I did not say there is no interference in the US or in the West generally. There is interference. They try to play their role. But to say that it's the same thing, like you said yourself, in Pakistan, people have gotten beaten up and killed. And you mentioned a couple of very important cases in the US, like the story, and by the way, that's a local story at the Mercury News about the crack cocaine epidemic. And that is an exception in the US. The fact that we can point to it is actually a good sign. And it's always a struggle, that's given. But in Pakistan, it's a daily occurrence. And by the way, the BBC is not... The BBC might
government,
it might
partly government control also.
See, that's the other thing about independent versus free. The BBC has a lot of freedom, but it's not a totally independent organization. It's semi-government in nature. So doing their background checks through the government institution, I don't think it should happen, but it's an interesting point. But in Pakistan, what we have is daily interference. So in conclusion, I would say, and you asked where do we go from here, our media in Pakistan is evolving. Our state is evolving, our society is evolving, our security state is evolving. they are not doing, and I think they are still doing, in fact, some of that upfront, very crude interference, which is not good for society generally. It's not good for their own institutions. However, this recent break thing that is happening in the media is most probably half coming from a good thing, which is reducing government budgets and all of that. But on the other hand, the way it is happening, we do need to keep an eye on, be concerned about, try to help people. And to say that, oh, no, they should go do something else, I don't think it's fair. Media still has a role. People in the vast majority of the country still do listen to the radio, to TV, to newspapers. And to say that, no, they should, people should be kicked out if they're not support, that I don't think is fair. We do need to find a better way forward.
Yeah, so ladies and gentlemen, you heard my friend's views, and we all discuss these things, and time to time I have opportunity to talk to media persons in Pakistan, and pretty much all those things they say I hear from my both panelists. So this was all for today's Viewpoint from Overseas. Keep watching Viewpoint from Overseas. I am your host, Misbah Azam.